Part two. I opened by trying to understand what was like so funny about a girl named Othello, and I tried to like treat that, or like locate that kind of question within and across the performance history of the play without much regard for time or place. But it's sort of impossible any longer to talk about a passage of time without sort of talking about the passions of place when it comes to questions of blackface, race, Othello, and casting. Because these questions have a very different and a very particular valence in the American South than they do and did on the London South Bank. So I want to, just like for the rest of this, just like repatriate the conversations in the 1960s London to 1860s America and see how these questions apply somewhat closer to home. First, some quick background. Othello was incredibly popular in the antebellum American South, which may be surprising. The play was performed on southern stages up to the Civil War, running a close fourth behind Richard III, Macbeth, and Hamlet. Charleston, South Carolina, saw 63 Othellos, from the earliest in 1809 through one late in 1860. It was performed in Memphis 20 times between 1837 and 1858, 41 times in Mobile, Alabama from 1832 until 1860, 22 times from 1846 through 1860 in Louisville. And in New Orleans, it averaged more than 1.5 performances annually through 1860. Why you would want to produce 1/2 of that? I don't know. Not a statistician. But so you might sort of ponder the question, like, why was this play so sort of like popular in the antebellum South? And you might be sort of tempted to sort of adopt a line from the play itself and say that antebellum Southern audiences were in love with what they feared to look on, hence the play's popularity. Now, a certain strain of theater criticism has tried to understand and explain this popularity by, yes, focusing on the makeup of the actors playing Othello at this time, to try to account for the success. And many critics have sort of like tried to sort of like argue that, well, Othellos in the antebellum South were played in quite light makeup, right? So they sort of, and scholars have sort of poured over reviews and illustrations and paintings from the era to try to determine like, precisely how darkly Charles Macready was made up as Othello, or Booth or Keene, they played more in the American South. And even if I take me at my word that like reading through sort of like critical discussions of the peculiar gradients of somebody's makeup is a dispiriting affair. I wouldn't suggest it. But again, so like even in the American South, particularly in the American South, during the years leading up to the Civil War, the kind of meta-commentary surrounding the theatrical history of Othello preoccupies itself with discussions of the Othello's makeup. And again, of course, I'm suggesting that we focus on the made-up at the expense of the real in this case. And of course, there's a good reason that theater historians do this, because blackface in the American South has a particular and embarrassing valence, which may explain the kind of critical imperative to whiten Othello as much as possible, to distance him from the tradition of minstrel performances. And in fact, it's probably unsurprising to you that given the success, given the popularity of Shakespearean adaptations within the American vaudeville vernacular, it's unsurprising and sort of like predictable even that there survived several blackface adaptations of Othello from the period, which were incredibly popular on the American stages. And these sort of like vaudeville blackface sort of minstrel shows of Othello, capitalized on sort of like black English on the stage, and they frequently transformed the murder scene into a sort of slapstick affair. And we don't have really time to go into the particulars of these, and they are extraordinary to look at. But I'll just sort of like reference one burlesque in which Desdemona enters into the final scene with a black eye, which is a pertinent term in this conversation, like the violence turning her face partially black. And she vows, quote, "I really think Othello must be mad. That was the hardest thump I ever had. Just one day married and to cut this figure, but I'll have satisfaction on that." You can fill in the blanks. Right? But so however dark or light the antebellum Othellos may have been, what does seem broadly and interestingly true is that after the Civil War, Othello was seldom seen in the American South, except in these kind of parodies, some of these burlesques I just mentioned. When he did appear, when the play did appear on the legitimate stage after the Civil War, Othello was deliberately whitened, so orientalized was the idea in the period. And in this context, of course, it's tantalizing to note that the American coinage miscegenation didn't enter the language until 1864, right? When there suddenly seemed to be a need for like a special taboo to kind of worry about this problem of mixed sexual relationships. But another way to sort of think about this is like Othello's skin on the stage literally faded as fears of miscegenation rose at the same time. And so one of the sort of like impressions that I'm like trying to tease out here is that for the famous formulation of these sort of like dread of one drop of black blood, we might substitute one drop of black makeup, in which, again, keeping the Desdemona actor's skin untainted for black makeup becomes a way to think about and perform fears of miscegenation. Now this brings me to the here and now, Othello in the New South. Now, like you, I live in a small, charming southern town with a successful and active Shakespearean enterprise. And the last Othello I saw was therefore at the Blackfriars Playhouse in Stanton, Virginia. This is a theater built in sort of good faith estimation or approximation of the indoor playhouse where Othello was originally performed. It was a very good show. But it was impossible for me not to notice that on most nights, the very fine African-American actor who played Othello, a man named Renee Thornton, was the only black man or woman for that matter on the stage, and often in the audience. Now this has not been unusual for regional or smaller professional theaters. But it is sort of difficult to escape the fact that the racial composition of the cast of Othello mirrored, if that's the right word, the racial composition of the community being portrayed in Othello, in which Othello's skin alienates him from his peers. So that even in the post-blackface era of Othello, the politics of casting practices are inevitably and uncomfortably foregrounded during the play's performance. During that same season where Othello was being performed, they were performing Titus Andronicus as well, and the same actor who was playing Othello played Aaron the Moor in that play. And there was a particularly unsettling moment in that play, I think for me and probably for many others, in which Renee, again, the actor, playing Aaron, has a noose placed around his neck near the end of that play, as Aaron is being threatened with hanging for, among other things, getting a black baby on a white queen. Now, I live, after all, about an hour from Lynchburg, Virginia, right? A town founded and named after Colonel Charles Lynch, whose sort of enthusiasm for extrajudicial punishment gives us the term lynching. And so there was Renee standing on this very southern stage with the noose around his neck surrounded by white people. Now, of course, it's just a theater, it's just a play, so that nobody imagines that he's actually going to hang. This is what I call, of course, the audience's willing disbelief and suspension. You used to have to laugh at those things. But the point is, like, this moment was, like, you know, incredibly uncomfortable, right? Is the sort of point I'm trying to make. Nor does it sort of expand outside of the playhouse a little bit. Was it impossible not to reflect on the flat fact that the Blackfriars Playhouse in Stanton, Virginia, is a recreation of a theater in which Othello would have been played by a white man in black makeup. Nor was it further impossible to entirely forget that the Blackfriars Playhouse in Stanton is literally flanked on one side by the Stonewall Jackson Hotel and on the other by the Dixie Movie Theater. Right? The Dixie Movie Theater was a beautiful little theater. It was like built in 1912 to host vaudeville shows, right? Which included, of course, the durably popular blackface sketches that we've already referenced. We're talking Central Virginia in the early 20th century, after all. Interestingly, that theater was converted from a sort of playhouse to a movie house in 1920s when Warner Brothers leased the theater, and it became one of the first theaters in Virginia to be wired for sound. And this was specifically done in order to show Warner Brothers' revolutionary new talking picture. You're probably way ahead of me at this point, which was, of course, The Jazz Singer in 1927, featuring the famous blackface performer Al Jolson, whose first song in that film is Dirty Hands, Dirty Face. So I wondered, kind of in short, what it means to play Othello bracketed by these sort of peculiar institutions. A hotel that didn't welcome African Americans for most of its history, and a movie theater that African Americans inhabited only as the garishly painted faces for the majority of its history. This is another way of saying, of course, that quite obviously the peculiar institution that must bracket all performances of Othello today dramatically calls that whether they're physically, materially there or not, is our own history of chattel slavery that surrounds this play, and includes our own sort of sorry history of efforts to keep black blood from white blood and black skin from white. Today, we have, of course, thankfully left blackface behind, and I think adopted the salutary practice of casting black actors as Othello. But I don't think we can kid ourselves. We've traded old problems for new ones. The banishment of Blackfriars from the Othello performance history allows us to forget, for the moment, our own history of minstrel performances. It also solves the technical and political and erotic problem of racial transference. But though Othello's makeup may no longer rub off on Desdemona, something in the play's makeup continues to rub off on us, and I hope always will, get under our skin and baffle our impulses to find something inherently funny or anxious in the idea of Desdemona sharing Othello's skin. In conclusion, let me say this. Most of this talk I've been kind of teasing away at theater history, which is a weird kind of history, right? It's sort of a history of grown men and women playing dress-up, make-believe, telling stories written long ago and featuring people who lived long away. But there's something even closer to home that I want to share with you, something that actually happened. And so I close, therefore, with a name from the archives, one that attracts but also resists interpretation. In the 1860 U.S. Census of Arkansas, completed just 2 years before the outbreak of the war, we find recorded the following name: Othello A.E. Cockerell, child of Allen Cockerell and Sarah Adeline Harlan, born in 1856 at Benton Township, Conway, Arkansas. The name appears again in the census of 14 July 1870. I will not tell you what this means because I do not understand what it means. But I want to just leave you instead, before we see this agonizing play tonight, to meditate upon what it might have meant. What were the extraordinary complex of motivations, aspirations, anxieties, and desires that led Allen Cockerell and his wife Sarah in the year 1856 to give the name of Othello to their newly born white daughter?
Oh, wow.